Welcome to our first video in our new series focused on the biology of cells, which are the smallest fundamental units of life in the same way that the atom is the smallest fundamental unit of chemistry. In this video, we're going to learn to distinguish between two categories of cells, the first of which being what we call prokaryotic cells, which are exemplified by single-celled microorganisms that we call bacteria. Now, humans and pretty much all other animal cells are not examples of prokaryotic cells. They are what we call eukaryotic cells, but animals, including humans, are not the only examples of eukaryotes. The other examples of common eukaryotic or eukaryote cells are plants, which, believe it or not, have more in common with animals, including humans, than they do bacteria, as well as organisms called fungi, which are commonly mistaken for plants. So what exactly is the distinction between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells? Well, that has to do with this root of both of the words here. Karyo is a prefix that refers to the unit of organization of DNA, that being what we call chromosomes. So whenever we see something that begins with the word this is short for proto, which actually means before. So the earliest examples of organisms that contain DNA organized into chromosomes were organisms that were very similar to modern bacteria today. Now, whenever we see anything with the prefix EU, this indicates that we are looking at a newer organism, and obviously animals, plants, and fungi came far long after the world was dominated by bacteria. So the remainder of this video, we're going to look at the structural differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells so that you have the ability to distinguish between the two. Now, the first difference is how the chromosomes, that being the organizational units of DNA, are found within the cell. Now, the primary distinguishing feature of the two cells is actually this structure here. So in eukaryotic cells, all DNA, or pretty much all of the DNA within eukaryotic cells, is contained within this structure, which is what we call the nucleus. So in the same way that the nucleus is the center of an atom, we regard the nucleus of the cell as the control center of the cell, because this is where all eukaryotic DNA, for the most part, is contained. Whereas in bacteria, we see that there is no equivalent structure. Nuclei is just plural for nucleus. We can see that this bacterium here does not have a distinct nucleus, and its DNA is kind of floating around in the liquid part of the cell. Now, the next distinction is actually in how the DNA of eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells is actually organized. For example, if we were to remove all of the DNA from a bacterial cell and elongate it, it would look something like this. So prokaryotic cells typically have what we call circular chromosomes, which are usually found in one single chromosome, in one single piece. So here we can see that 100% of the DNA that is required to make this bacterium what it is found in this ring of DNA that we see here. Whereas this is definitely not true when it comes to eukaryotic chromosomes. Eukaryotic chromosomes are linear, meaning that their DNA is not bound in a circle like this and is actually found in straight lines of DNA. And rather than being in a single unit like we find in prokaryotes, we usually find that eukaryotic DNA exists in separate fragments. For example, humans actually have 46 different chromosomes that are contained on separate fragments. Although we almost never refer to this as 46, we prefer the number 23 times 2. We say 23 times 2 because half of your chromosomes, 23 of them, came from your father, and then the other 23 that make up the 23 times 2 came from your mother. And this is true about all plants, animals, and fungi that reproduce sexually, which is something that bacteria cannot do. Now, one of the other obvious features we can see from this animal cell structure here is that there are distinct structures that we find within the animal cell, and these are what we call organelles. Now, if we break down this word here, we can see that the word organ is the root of this word. And yes, this is the same word that refers to the heart, the brain, the liver, the stomach, the pancreas, the skin, etc., and all of the different organs that all together have different functions. Each of your internal organs has a specific job that it does within the body, and your body does not have the ability to survive without any of the singular organs. For example, you cannot survive without a heart, without a brain, without kidneys, without liver, without a pancreas, without a stomach. You need every single one of them, in the same way that each of these organelles within the cell has a very well-defined and predictable function, and if we were to remove one of them, the cell would not be able to function. So you can think of the organelles as the small organs. In fact, this little suffix here simply means small. So you can think of the organelles as the small organs of a eukaryotic cell, whereas bacteria barely have any organelles at all. In fact, there is only one specific organelle that bacteria share in common with eukaryotic organisms, and that is these small dots that we find littered inside of the bacterium and on this structure in the eukaryotic cell, which we will explore in future videos. Now, one feature which we will explore when we talk about how cells protect themselves that all bacteria require is a structure outside of their cell, or on the outermost layer of the cell, and this is called a cell wall that exists for protection as well as other functions, and some eukaryotes have their own cell walls, but these are different structures than the cell walls that are found inside of prokaryotic organisms. For example, plants and fungi require cell walls, but other eukaryotic organisms, including animals, which includes us, do not require cell walls. Now, the most obvious difference that we can see in our day-to-day lives, because again, most people will never be able to see what an animal cell looks like under a microscope unless you study research biology, but because people will not usually be able to see how big a bacterium is compared to the cells of a eukaryotic organism, the distinction is in how many cells are required to make up an organism. For example, this bacterium is only one cell, and this is the complete organism. If this bacterium were to make another bacterium in its place, you would have a different organism, and therefore bacteria and other prokaryotes are exclusively unicellular, meaning that each organism is only made up of one cell. And there are actually unicellular eukaryotes. For example, if you leave a loaf of bread or any starchy food in a damp environment where organisms can grow on it, eventually you're going to find mold, and mold is a unicellular species of fungus that is able to grow on food and digest it because it needs to digest food in order to eat. However, most well-known eukaryotes definitely are not single-celled. For example, humans are obviously made of many, many different cells, and therefore we would be what we call multicellular organisms, meaning that it takes many not just many cells, but many different types of cells in order to make up complex organisms such as a human, a dog, or perhaps a very, very large tree is also an example of a multicellular organism. Now that you can distinguish between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, in the next series, or in the subsequent videos in this series, we're going to be exploring the roles of the different components that make up a eukaryotic cell and how those components work together in order to keep the organism alive.